The most feared man in the city thought he was untouchable. He controlled judges, owned politicians, and had buried enemies without losing a single night's sleep. But the one person he never saw coming was the woman sitting quietly across the dinner table, pregnant with his child, watching him lie straight to her face with a smile she no longer believed. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she started taking notes. This is the story of how Elena Moretti, a museum curator who married into hell, dismantled a mafia empire not with violence, but with patience, silence, and one unforgettable evening that brought an entire criminal dynasty to its knees. If this story hits different, drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain came down hard that Tuesday night, the kind of rain that turns city streets into black mirrors and makes honest men stay home. Dante Moretti was not an honest man, but he had rules, and for 15 years those rules had kept him alive when better men were rotting in unmarked graves somewhere outside the city limits. He stood at the window of his study, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a month, holding a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. The study smelled like leather and old wood, and something Elena had once called the smell of a man who thinks too much. She'd said it laughing, back when laughing together was still something they did. That felt like a long time ago. Downstairs he could hear her moving around the kitchen, soft footsteps, the quiet clink of a glass. She was 5 months pregnant and still refused to let anyone cook for her past 9 in the evening. That stubbornness, that particular brand of quiet defiance, was one of the things that had made him fall in love with her 11 years ago, before the empire, before the weight of it all settled permanently across his shoulders. His phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't need to look at it to know who it was. He picked it up anyway. "Thursday still work?" He typed back 2 words, deleted them, typed again. His thumb hovered. Downstairs, Elena's footsteps had stopped. He hit send, pocketed the phone, finished the scotch in one swallow. When he came downstairs, Elena was sitting at the kitchen island with a bowl of pasta she'd made from scratch. Not because she was hungry, she said, but because keeping her hands busy kept her from thinking too hard. She looked up when he walked in. Her dark eyes moved over him the way they always did, reading him like she was scanning a document for the line that didn't add up. "Long day?" she said. "The Castellano situation is getting complicated. It's always the Castellano situation." She turned back to her food. "Or the Ferreira problem. Or the docks. There's always something, Dante." He sat across from her. The kitchen was warm, lit softly, the kind of domestic scene that looked peaceful from the outside. He reached over and touched her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't curl her fingers around his either. She just let it sit there. "I'm handling it," he said. "I know you are." Her voice was even, neutral. He'd always admired how she could make a sentence sound like nothing when it was clearly something. "How's the baby?" For the first time that evening, something real crossed her face. Her free hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a gesture so automatic she probably didn't notice she was doing it anymore. "She kicked today, twice, right when I was trying to read, like she already knows how to interrupt at the worst possible moment." A small smile. "She's yours, all right," Dante laughed. It came out genuine, which surprised even him. They sat in the warm kitchen with the rain hammering the windows, and for a few minutes it almost felt like the version of his life he sometimes imagined. The simpler one. The one without the weight of an empire pressing down on his sternum every minute of every day. Then his phone buzzed again. He left it in his pocket. He lasted 4 minutes before he excused himself to take a call from Marco. Elena watched him walk out of the kitchen. She set her fork down very carefully, like she was placing it on a surface made of glass. She didn't eat the rest of the pasta. Dante Moretti had inherited the family business at 31, 2 years after his father, the legendary Enzo Moretti, a man who once made a sitting senator cry in a parking garage, had suffered a stroke that left him half paralyzed and permanently out of commission. The transition had not been graceful. 3 captains challenged his authority in the first 6 months. 2 of them backed down when Dante made it clear, quietly and without theatrics, what the consequences of disloyalty looked like. The third one, a man named Ciro, who had 20 years on Dante and thought seniority was the same as power, was found 6 weeks later in the back of his own car, parked at the airport long-term lot, with a note tucked into his jacket pocket that simply read, "Retirement looks good on you." Nobody challenged Dante after that. By 35, he had expanded the family's reach into legitimate real estate, port logistics, and municipal contracting. By 40, he had enough politicians in his pocket that he barely had to make threats anymore. A raised eyebrow at a fundraiser was enough to redirect a city contract, derail an investigation, or remind a councilman that his son's gambling debts were being quietly managed by people who appreciated cooperation. He was not a man who made mistakes. He was not a man who got sloppy, which is exactly what made what he was doing so dangerous. Not to his enemies, but to himself. He'd met Vivian Cross at a financial conference 14 months ago. She was 33, sharp as a blade, and she had a way of talking about offshore asset structures that made it sound like poetry. She worked for a legitimate consulting firm, had no idea who he really was when they first spoke, and had pushed back on 2 of his assumptions in the first 15 minutes of conversation. He'd found that irresistible. He told himself it was nothing, a distraction. A man in his position needed pressure valves, and this was simply that, a release, controlled and temporary, the kind of thing powerful men had always allowed themselves without apology. But Vivian Cross was not a woman who stayed temporary. She had a way of getting underneath things. She asked questions nobody asked him, not about business, not about money, about him, what he regretted, what kept him up at night, what he would have done differently if he'd had the choice at 25. He answered her, which was the first real mistake. By month 4, he was lying to Elena with a frequency and fluency that would have disturbed him if he'd been paying enough attention to notice. Business trips that weren't, meetings that ran late, a phone that was always face down on any surface Elena might walk past. He told Vivian what men always tell the other woman, that the marriage was over in everything but name, that he'd been emotionally alone for years, that the divorce was coming. He just needed to handle it at the right time for the sake of the business, for the sake of stability. Vivian believed him because she wanted to, and because he was very, very good at making people believe things. What Dante did not account for, what he had never, in 15 years of running an empire built on intelligence and calculation, thought to consider, was the woman he was actually married to. Elena Moretti had grown up in the house of Judge Raymond Caruso, her father, a man who believed evidence was the only currency that actually held its value. She'd watched him build cases from nothing but paper and patience. She'd grown up understanding that the loudest voice in a room was rarely the most dangerous one, and that the moment a person showed you they were capable of lying, you stopped asking whether they were lying and started asking what else they were lying about. She had known something was wrong for almost 7 months before that rainy Tuesday. She noticed the small things first, the way anyone trained to notice small things does. A receipt in a suit pocket, dinner for 2 at a restaurant she'd never heard of, on a night he'd supposedly been at a port negotiation that ran until midnight. A text notification she'd glimpsed when she'd reached for his phone to show him a photo of the nursery furniture she liked. Just a name, just a letter, V. His voice when he was on the phone in the study, a different register than his business voice. Warmer, more careful. She had sat with this knowledge the way you sit with a splinter you're not yet ready to dig out, knowing it's there, feeling it with every movement, telling yourself you'll deal with it soon. The night she followed him was a Thursday in early April. He'd told her he was meeting with 2 of the captains to deal with a disagreement over distribution territory, the kind of meeting that happened at nondescript restaurants in non-residential neighborhoods, cash-only places where the owner knew to lose the security footage. She knew what those meetings looked like. She'd heard enough about them over 11 years to build a fairly accurate picture. She'd hired a car she'd paid for in cash and followed his black Mercedes across town. He did not go to a nondescript restaurant in a non-residential neighborhood. He went to Arlene's, a place on the corner of 5th and Whitmore, with a prix-fixe menu and candles on every table, and a sommelier who'd appeared in 3 different food publications. Elena had walked past it once and told Dante she'd like to go someday. He'd said sure, absolutely, they'd go soon. She sat in the back of the hired car across the street and watched Dante Moretti walk through the front door of Arlene's and embrace a tall woman in a blue dress with the kind of ease that comes from months of practice. Not a business greeting, not a handshake or a European double kiss, his hand on the small of her back. A smile she recognized, the smile she thought belonged to her. The hired driver had the tact not to say anything. Elena sat in the back seat with her hand on her stomach and felt the baby move. One slow, deliberate kick, as if the child already understood that something in the world had just shifted permanently. She did not cry. Not then. She had inherited her father's discipline about that, too. You did not cry at the evidence. You cried later, alone, where it didn't compromise the case. She said, "Take me home, please," in a voice that didn't shake. And then she started building. The attorney's name was Carol Voss. She was 61 years old, wore no jewelry except a watch, and had spent the better part of 3 decades helping women escape men who believed their power made them immune to consequences. She had taken on 2 Mafia-adjacent divorces in her career. She had won both. When Elena walked into her office on a Wednesday morning and laid out what she knew in clear sequential order, names, dates, receipts, the name of the restaurant, a description of the woman, the timeline of behavioral changes, Carol Voss had leaned back in her chair and looked at her for a long moment. "Most women come in here still hoping I'm going to tell them they're wrong," she said. "I know I'm not wrong," Elena said. "You're going to need documentation that holds in civil court, regardless of how he tries to challenge it, and he will try to challenge everything." "I know. His attorneys will be expensive and aggressive. I grew up with a judge for a father. I understand expensive and aggressive." Elena folded her hands on the edge of the desk. "What I need to know is whether you can make sure that when this ends, he cannot touch what I walk away with." Carol Voss smiled for the first time. "Tell me everything." For the next 3 months, Elena Moretti led 2 parallel lives with a precision that would have impressed her husband if he'd been capable of seeing past his own reflection. On the surface, she was the devoted, expectant wife. She attended dinners, smiled at captains' wives, let Dante press his hand against her stomach when the baby moved, and said all the right things at all the right moments. She was warm without being effusive, present without being demanding. She gave him absolutely no reason to look closely. Underneath that, she was building a case that would take his world apart. She documented every unexplained expense, the hotel charges on the business account, the restaurant bills, the flights that didn't match his stated itineraries. She hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Sullivan, who had the kind of face that nobody remembered and the kind of patience that made him exceptional at his work. Sullivan produced photographs, receipts, and on 2 occasions, audio recordings of Dante making arrangements that had nothing to do with mafia business. She worked with Carol Voss's forensic accountant to trace 3 shell companies Dante had established without her knowledge, accounts through which he had been quietly funneling money, whether for operational use or something more personal. The accountant couldn't say with certainty. What the accountant could say was that the money trail was real, documented, and survivable in court if handled correctly. Elena printed nothing on printers connected to any network Dante could access. She stored nothing on her phone. She kept physical documents in a safety deposit box registered under her maiden name at a bank branch on the east side of the city, a branch she'd selected specifically because it was nowhere Dante's people would think to look. She was 5 months pregnant when she started. She was 7.5 months pregnant when she had everything she needed. She sat alone in her home office one evening, Dante was away again, supposedly in Philadelphia, and spread the documents across the desk. Photographs, financial records, printed text threads Sullivan had obtained through means she'd agreed not to ask about, a timeline spanning 14 months. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her cousin Adriana, who had an event planning company, and said, "I need to throw a party." The invitations went out under the banner of a celebration for the Moretti baby, a formal gathering at the estate, the kind of event that signaled strength and continuity and everything a mafia dynasty was supposed to project to the world. Dante was pleased. He saw it as good optics, a public demonstration of family stability at a moment when 2 rival families were quietly testing his edges. "It's exactly the right move," he told Elena over breakfast, genuinely enthusiastic for the first time in weeks. "Show everyone the family is solid. New generation coming. It sends a message." "That's what I was thinking," Elena said, and poured him more coffee. She sent one additional invitation through an anonymous channel to Vivian Cross, a personal note suggesting that Dante had arranged for her to attend, that this would be the night he finally made things clear to everyone who mattered. Vivian Cross, who had been waiting 7 months for exactly that moment, RSVP'd within the hour. Elena set her phone face down on the counter, pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, and stared out the kitchen window at the gray morning sky. The party was in 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to keep her hands steady, her face neutral, and her voice perfectly, completely, devastatingly calm. She was her father's daughter. She could do 3 weeks standing on her head. What she could not have predicted, what she would not let herself think about too carefully, not yet, was the moment she would have to stand in front of everyone who had ever watched her and Dante together and show them what the man she'd loved for 11 years had actually been. She pressed the thought down, sorted it away. There would be time to feel it later. There was still work to do, and somewhere across the city, in a hotel room with a view of the river, the most feared man in town was lying in bed next to a woman who thought she knew who he was, completely unaware that the two women he had spent a year deceiving were now, in their own separate silences, each counting down to the same night. The clock was already running. Dante Moretti just didn't know it yet. The first thing Elena did the morning after she sent Vivian Cross's invitation was make breakfast. Not because she was hungry, not because the routine comforted her. She made breakfast because Dante was home that morning, sitting at the kitchen island with his phone and his coffee and the particular kind of distracted silence that had become his default setting around her, and she needed to stand 6 feet away from him and crack eggs into a pan without her hands shaking. She cracked 4 eggs. Her hands were steady. That was when she knew she was going to be all right. Dante looked up from his phone twice while she cooked. Once to ask if she'd seen the file he'd left on the hallway table, once to say the guest list for the party looked good, that Marco had confirmed the Ferreira family would send a representative, which was significant because the Ferreiras hadn't shown up to anything Moretti hosted in 3 years. He said it like he was telling her the weather, like a business update delivered to an assistant who needed to know the schedule. "That's good," she said, and slid the eggs onto a plate. "It means they're still watching which way the wind blows." He picked up his fork. "A party like this, it signals continuity, strength. People show up when they think a dynasty's still standing." Elena sat across from him and picked up her orange juice and said, "Well, then we better make sure the party is perfect." He smiled at her, genuine, easy. The smile of a man with a clean conscience who had simply convinced himself that the inconvenient parts of his life existed in a separate sealed compartment that could never leak. She smiled back, and she thought, 3 weeks. After he left for the morning, she went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for 7 minutes. She breathed. She put both hands on the sides of her stomach and felt the baby shift, a slow roll like the child was readjusting, getting comfortable. "I know," she said quietly, to herself, to the baby, to the empty bathroom. "I know." Then she stood up, washed her face with cold water, and went to call Sullivan. Sullivan's office was not really an office. It was the back corner of a print shop on Delancey Street that his brother-in-law owned, separated from the main floor by a heavy curtain and furnished with 2 folding chairs, a metal desk, and a filing cabinet that he kept padlocked even when he was sitting right next to it. He was a compact man, late 50s, with a gray mustache and the permanent expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime in the early 2000s. He slid a manila envelope across the desk without preamble. "Philadelphia," he said. 3 nights. He was not at the Castellano negotiation. Elena opened the envelope. Photographs. Dante and Vivian at a restaurant with river views. Dante and Vivian walking along a waterfront. A hotel receipt under a shell entity she recognized from the accountant's documentation, one of the 3 companies she'd been tracking. "Is it the same account as the one in March?" "Same account, different property name. He rotates the LLC names every few months." Sullivan leaned back. "Whoever set this up for him knew what they were doing, but the underlying account numbers don't change. That's what your accountant needs to follow." "She already has them." Sullivan looked at her for a moment. Not the way most men looked at her. Not with assessment or condescension or the particular brand of skepticism men reserve for women doing things men thought required a man. He looked at her the way someone looks at another professional whose work they respect. "You want to know about the woman," he said. It wasn't a question. "Tell me what you know." Vivian Cross, 33. Legitimate career, genuinely legitimate. She's not connected to any of the families, no criminal record, no known associations. Grew up in Charlotte, moved here 6 years ago. Her firm handles offshore compliance consulting for high-net-worth clients. He paused. "She thinks he's leaving you." The words landed. Elena kept her face still. How confident are you in that? Confident enough? I spoke with someone who knows someone in her professional circle. Apparently, she's been telling people she's in a serious relationship with a man who's finalizing a complicated divorce. She believes it. Sullivan's voice carried nothing. No judgment, no sympathy, just the clean delivery of information. She's not a plant. She's not playing him. She's a victim of the same thing you are. Elena set the photographs back in the envelope, squared the edges carefully. That changes something, she said. Does it change the plan? No. She picked up her bag. It changes the invitation. 2 weeks before the party, Dante started to get sloppy in a way that people around him noticed before he did. It started at a Wednesday sit-down with 3 of his senior captains. Marco Vitelli, a heavy-set man in his late 50s who had been with the Moretti family since Enzo's time. Sal Bracco, younger, sharper, deeply loyal to Dante personally, and a captain named Reese, who had come up through the port operations and whose loyalty, like most things, was ultimately transactional. They were discussing the Ferreira situation, which had grown more complicated than the public détente suggested. There had been an incident at the docks. A shipment redirected without authorization, a driver who claimed he'd received orders he hadn't received, money that ended up somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. The kind of incident that required immediate, clear-headed attention and a decisive response. Dante was 40 minutes late. He walked in distracted, his jacket slightly wrong. Not disheveled, just slightly off, like he'd dressed quickly in low light. And he sat down and looked at the 3 men and said, "Where are we?" Marco looked at Sal. Sal looked at his hands. Reese looked directly at Dante with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that masks something less neutral underneath. "We've been waiting on you," Marco said. His voice was flat. "I had something run long. Walk me through the dock situation." They walked him through it. Dante listened, or appeared to listen, but 3 times in 40 minutes he glanced at the phone sitting face down on the table. The 3rd time, Marco stopped mid-sentence and waited. Dante looked up. "Am I keeping you?" Marco said. The temperature in the room dropped. Dante looked at Marco for a long moment. In the old days, even a year ago, that look alone would have made a man like Marco reset immediately, backpedal, choose different words. But something in the old authority had developed a hairline fracture, and Marco, who had known Dante since he was a boy, could feel it. "You're not keeping me," Dante said, quietly, dangerously quiet. "Then the phone can wait." Silence. Sal had gone very still. Reese was examining a spot on the table. Dante picked up the phone and put it in his jacket pocket. "Continue," Marco continued. But the moment sat in the room like smoke, invisible and permanent. After the meeting, Sal caught Marco in the hallway. "Don't do that again," Sal said, low and fast. "Someone has to," Marco said. "He hasn't been right in months. You see it. I see it. Reese definitely sees it, and Reese is already making calls. Reese making calls is exactly why you don't undercut him in a room with Reese sitting in it." Marco stopped walking. He turned to look at Sal with the worn expression of a man who has watched too many dynasties quietly begin to unravel. "What is it?" Sal said. "The woman?" "There's always a woman when a man starts losing his mind at the wrong time." Marco shrugged his heavy shoulders. His father was the same way once. He got over it. He paused. His father also had better enemies than we do currently. He walked away down the corridor, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Sal stood alone in the hallway and thought about Reese already making calls, and what that meant, and how much time they might or might not have before thinking about it became insufficient. Vivienne Cross received the 2nd message on a Thursday afternoon. The first message, the anonymous one telling her Dante had arranged for her to attend the party, had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and she'd spent the intervening time oscillating between certainty and doubt in the exhausting cycle that had become her emotional landscape since this had all started. Some days she was completely sure. He loved her. He'd said so. He'd said the words with his hand on her face in a hotel room in Philadelphia, looking directly at her, not at the ceiling, not past her, at her. Men who were running games did not look at you like that. Other days she woke up at 4 a.m. and stared at the ceiling of her apartment and thought, "You have never met his wife. You have never been to his home. In 14 months, you have not been introduced to a single person in his life. And every time you've asked about the divorce, he says soon, not yet. I need to handle it carefully. You know how complicated this is. She knew how complicated it was because he had explained it to her many times. The business, the optics, the child. God, the child. He'd told her about the pregnancy 6 weeks into whatever this was, and she had felt the floor shift under her feet, but he'd said it was already over between them, had been over for years. The child was an accident that had happened at the precise wrong moment in terms of timing, but that he would be a father and he would take responsibility, but that it changed nothing between himself and Elena in terms of the fundamental reality of the marriage. She had believed him. She had believed him because the alternative, that she had been sleeping with a man who was actively, deliberately, comprehensively lying to her while his wife was pregnant with his child, was a version of herself she could not afford to be. The second message arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and it came from the same anonymous address. It said only, "Make sure you arrive at 8. He'll be watching for you. This is the night everything changes." Vivian read it 3 times. She set her phone down on her desk and looked out her office window at the city below, and felt the complex, terrifying, desperate thing that happens when you have tied your hope so completely to one outcome that any forward motion toward it, however uncertain, feels like the only oxygen available. She typed back, "I'll be there." She spent the next week picking out a dress. She did not call Dante to confirm the details, because he had told her this event required a kind of discretion she needed to trust him on, that she'd understand everything once she arrived, that the plan required her to simply show up and let him handle the rest. In hindsight, she would understand exactly how that framing had worked. He hadn't said any of those things. She had assembled them from fragments of other conversations, from the anonymous message she'd assumed he'd sent, from the architecture of a narrative she'd needed to be true. But hindsight is only available after the fact, and the fact was still 10 days away. 5 days before the party, Dante did something he had not done in almost a year. He came home early. Elena was in the nursery, a room she'd been assembling slowly, deliberately, a piece at a time, in the manner of someone building something they intend to actually use. She had her back to the door when she heard him in the hallway, his footsteps recognizable after 11 years, the way any sound you've lived with long enough becomes part of your internal furniture. He appeared in the doorway and looked at her, and then at the room, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not guilt, exactly. Something softer than guilt and harder than nostalgia. The face of a man encountering evidence of the life he was in the process of detonating. "It looks good," he said. "I found the dresser at an estate sale. The woman running it said it was her mother's." Elena ran her hand along the top of it. "It needed refinishing, but it's solid wood. It'll last." Dante came into the room. He stood behind her and looked at the crib, the dresser, the soft rug on the floor, the small lamp in the corner that threw a warm yellow circle on the ceiling. He put his hands on her shoulders, careful, like he was asking permission. She let him. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "After the baby." He stopped, started again. "After things settle down. The Ferreira situation, the doc thing. Once it's stabilized, I want to step back from some of the day-to-day. Hand more to Marco and Sal. Spend time here." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "I want to be here, Elena." She was quiet for a moment. The baby moved, a long, slow stretch that she felt all the way up through her ribs. "What changed?" she said. He exhaled. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." She turned to look at him. His face was very close. His eyes were dark and tired, and she knew this face, had known it for 11 years. And she could see, clearly and without delusion, that part of what he was saying was real. That some fraction of Dante Moretti genuinely meant it. That he was capable of standing in this room, in front of the evidence of his impending fatherhood, and meaning the words coming out of his mouth. That was what made it so devastating. Not that he was entirely lying, that he was capable of meaning it and doing the other thing at the same time. "Okay," she said, evenly. "Let's talk about it after the party." He nodded. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the way he used to do without thinking. He stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at the room, and then he went back downstairs. Elena stood alone in the nursery for a long moment. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach. She had 4 days. The call came from Carol Voss's office on the morning of the party itself, at 7:43, while Elena was sitting in the chair at her vanity having her hair done by a woman named Patricia, who had been doing her hair for 6 years and understood that some mornings were not conversation mornings. "Everything is in place," Carol said. "Sullivan's contact has confirmed the documents are secured at the secondary location. If he tries to move on them before the court filing, he's too late. It's already done." "And the financial documentation?" "Delivered to my office by courier last night. Triplicates. One with me, one in the deposit box, one with my co-counsel who has instructions to open hers if she doesn't hear from me by midnight tonight." Elena looked at her own reflection in the vanity mirror. Patricia was working on the back section of her hair, calm and focused, acting in the merciful conspiracy of professional women everywhere who understand that sometimes you simply hold the moment together for someone without asking why. "One more thing," Carol said. "Are you absolutely sure about the format? Once it happens in that room, in front of those people, there is no version of afterward that puts it back." "I know. He will come after everything. He'll try." Elena watched her own face in the mirror. "That's why there's nothing left for him to come after." Carol was quiet for a moment. "All right then. I'll call you when it's done." She hung up. Patricia finished the last pin and stepped back to look at her work. Elena met her eyes in the mirror. "Beautiful," Patricia said. "Professional, warm, and not quite only about the hair." Elena stood, looked at herself. A woman in a pale dress, 7 months and 3 weeks pregnant, with her father's straight spine and her own particular brand of patience that had been building to this specific day for so long, it had almost become its own kind of peace. Downstairs she could hear the first caterers arriving, the sound of tables being arranged, voices coordinating placement of flowers, of glasses, of the portable screen her cousin Adriana had confirmed was installed in the ballroom on Monday morning and tested twice since. She heard Dante's voice among them, easy, commanding, the gracious host, saying something that made the caterers laugh. Elena took one breath, let it out. She picked up her small evening bag, checked that her phone and the folded set of papers she'd placed in it that morning were exactly where she'd put them, and went downstairs to greet her guests. The night had not yet started. But Elena Moretti had already won the only part of it that required her to be ready. And what was coming now was simply the moment when everyone else would find out what she already knew, standing in a room full of people who thought they understood the Moretti marriage, who thought they understood the man at the head of the table, who thought they understood which way the power in this family ran. Vivienne Cross was already in a car across the city, in the blue dress she'd chosen 10 days ago, watching the streets go past and telling herself tonight was the night everything changed. She was right. She just had no idea what kind of change was coming. And somewhere in the growing crowd of arriving guests, Mafia captains and their carefully composed wives, politicians with careful smiles, business partners with firm handshakes, and 2 aging members of the Moretti family who remembered when Enzo had run this house. A night that could not be undone was already beginning to tip past the edge of the last possible moment to stop it. The ballroom of the Moretti estate held 83 people that night. Elena had counted. Not obsessively, practically. She needed to know the weight of the room she was walking into, the way a surgeon needs to know exactly what they're cutting before the first incision. 83 people spread across 12 round tables covered in white linen, centerpieces of white and pale green flowers that Adriana had sourced from a florist in the East District. Candles that threw warm gold light across faces that ranged from genuinely happy to professionally cordial to quietly calculating. The Moretti Estate's ballroom had hosted events like this before. Enzo Moretti had believed firmly in the theater of power, that a man who knew how to throw a dinner was a man who understood that control was as much about aesthetics as it was about force. Dante had inherited this belief along with everything else. The room was a performance space, and everyone in it understood, on some level, that they were both audience and cast. Elena understood it better than any of them. She moved through the early part of the evening with a fluency that cost her more than she let show. She greeted Marco Vitelli's wife, a round, warm woman named Concetta, who kissed her on both cheeks and said she looked radiant, which Elena accepted with a smile that reached exactly far enough. She spoke with the 2 Ferrero representatives, who were polite and watchful in the way of men sent to observe rather than participate. She made conversation with a city councilman whose name she had seen in Dante's financial records, held for exactly 40 seconds, smiled, and moved on. Dante worked the opposite side of the room. She could feel him across the space, his particular gravitational pull, the way rooms reorganized themselves slightly around him. He caught her eye once, across 12 tables and 83 people, and raised his glass slightly. The proud husband, the expectant father, the man who had arranged this evening as a statement of dynastic continuity. She raised hers back. He had no idea, or so she believed, until 9:14 when Sal Bracco appeared at her left elbow with a glass of sparkling water he hadn't been asked to bring, and said very quietly without looking directly at her, "There's a problem." Elena kept her face exactly where it was. What kind of problem? The kind that needs 2 minutes of your time before dinner service starts. Still quiet, still not looking at her, performing casual conversation with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent decades learning how to say dangerous things in public without anyone noticing. She followed him through the side door off the ballroom into the narrow corridor that ran between the kitchen and the coat room. The noise of the party became a muffled pressure behind the closed door. Sal turned to face her. He was not a man who showed distress easily. She had known Sal Bracco for 9 years, had watched him sit across tables from men who were actively threatening his life, and hold his expression like concrete. Right now, something in the concrete had developed a crack. "He knows about the attorney," Sal said. The floor did not move. Elena kept her weight even, her hands loose at her sides. "How?" "Reese." Sal's jaw tightened. "Reese has been running his own information network for the last 4 months. One of his people saw you going into Carol Voss's building on a Wednesday morning back in May. It took him until last week to put together what Voss actually does." He paused. "He told Dante this afternoon, 2 hours before the first guests arrived." Elena breathed. In, out, steady. "What did Dante do?" "He's been on the phone with his own attorneys for the last hour. I don't know what they told him. I don't know what he's planning." Sal looked at her with something in his face that was not quite guilt and not quite apology, but occupied the same general territory as both. "I've known you for 9 years. I'm telling you because you deserve 30 seconds of warning more than you're currently getting. Does he know about the documents?" "I don't know what Reese knows. Reese knows about the attorney. Whether he's gotten further than that." Sal shook his head. "I can't tell you what I don't have." Elena was quiet for 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which her entire construction, 14 months of evidence, 3 months of legal preparation, the forensic accounting, the photographs, Sullivan's work, the triplicates at 3 separate locations, the portable screen in the ballroom that Adriana had confirmed was installed and tested. All of it ran through her mind in one fast, cold pass, like a hand of cards laid face up. She had built for this. She had built specifically for the version of this where Dante found out. The question was what he'd been told, and what he'd done about it in 2 hours. "Thank you," she said to Sal. She meant it. She went back through the side door and into the ballroom and found her seat. Dante was at the bar on the far side of the room when she re-entered. He was speaking with one of the Ferreira men, his posture easy, his drink in hand, performing the relaxed authority of a man with no pressing concerns. But Elena had spent 11 years reading this man, and she could see it from 40 feet away. The slight overcorrection in his shoulders, the way he was holding his jaw, the precise quality of the smile that was a fraction too composed. He'd been warned. He knew something. He did not know how much she had, or how far it had already traveled beyond his reach. That was the gap. That was the only gap still available to her, and she needed to cross the next 45 minutes without giving him any more information than Reese had already handed him. She sat at the head table. She spoke to Concetta on her left about the baby's name. They hadn't decided yet, she said, which was true. And to a museum colleague on her right about an exhibition that was opening in November, which she would or would not be able to attend depending on how the next several weeks resolved, though she did not say that part out loud. Dante came to the table. He sat. He put his hand over hers on the tablecloth, the same gesture he'd made 100 times, and she felt it differently now. Not as warmth, but as information. He was assessing her, testing the surface, trying to determine whether she knew that he knew. She gave him nothing. "You look beautiful tonight," he said. "Thank you." She smiled. "You look tired." Something flickered behind his eyes, fast, controlled. "Long week." "Nearly over." He looked at her for 1 beat too long. She held it without blinking and then turned to say something to Concetta, and she felt him watching the side of her face for the next 40 seconds before he picked up his fork. Dinner service began. The slideshow started at 9:53. Adriana had coordinated the audio-visual setup with a professionalism that Elena had trusted completely, and the trust had been merited. The screen descended from its housing in the ceiling smoothly, the projector opened on the first image without hesitation, and the music that Adriana had selected, something soft and string-heavy, began at exactly the right volume. The room settled. Conversations quieted. People turned in their chairs. The first images were exactly what everyone expected. Elena and Dante at 22, in the kind of photograph that exists only in early relationships. Slightly blurry, genuinely happy, uncalculated. Their wedding, which had been held in a garden in June 11 years ago, white everywhere. Dante in a dark suit looking at Elena with an expression that had made 3 women in the front row cry. Vacations. The Italian coast. A winter week somewhere with snow. And then the ultrasound image, which produced an audible collective exhale from the room, the sound of 83 people simultaneously softening. Elena was standing at the side of the room by this point. She had excused herself from the table quietly during the dessert course, citing the practical needs of a woman in her 3rd trimester, and nobody had looked twice. She was standing at the panel near the AV booth that Adriana had shown her on Monday morning. Her fingers rested lightly on the small remote control in her hand. She looked at Dante across the room. He was watching the ultrasound image on the screen with something that looked from this distance genuinely like tenderness. She pressed the button. The ultrasound image disappeared. And the room, which had been soft and warm and full of the communal ease of people who believe they are attending a celebration, went very quiet in a way that was a completely different kind of quiet than the kind that comes from sentiment. The first photograph was taken by Sullivan 6 months ago outside a restaurant in the theater district. Dante and Vivienne caught mid-laugh, his hand at her waist, her face turned up toward his, recognizable, unambiguous. The second was the hotel in Philadelphia. The third was a text thread, printed and photographed, enlarged enough to read from the 3rd row of tables. I've never wanted anything the way I want this. D. I know. Me too. I'll tell her soon. I promise. V. The fourth was a financial document, one of the shell company transfer records, annotated and read by the forensic accountant, with Dante's signature visible at the bottom right corner. The music had stopped. Elena didn't remember it stopping, but it had. The room was not silent in the way that means peaceful. It was silent in the way that means every person present is holding very still, because the air has changed, and nobody is certain yet what kind of danger they are in the presence of. 82 people stared at the screen. The 83rd was looking at the door. Vivienne Cross had arrived at 9:45, 20 minutes into dessert service, admitted by one of Adriana's staff who had been specifically briefed. She had stood at the back of the room for 8 minutes, taking in the scale of what she was inside. The estate, the crowd, the photographs of Dante and Elena that lined the entrance hall, the evidence everywhere she looked that this was not a marriage that existed only on paper. She had been standing at the back of the ballroom for 6 minutes when the slideshow changed. She saw her own face on a 12-foot screen. She saw the text messages she had written in a hotel bed in Philadelphia at 2 a.m. 3 months ago, when she had been certain, absolutely certain, that she was part of something real. The sound she made was very small. It didn't carry past the 2 people standing closest to her. Dante moved. He was on his feet before the 4th image had been on the screen for 5 seconds, and the movement itself, the sudden controlled urgency of a man used to managing crises physically, drew every eye in the room off the screen and onto him, which was perhaps the worst possible thing that could have happened because it confirmed, in case the photographs had left any room for interpretation, that this was real. Elena. His voice was low and very controlled. He was crossing the room toward her. Elena, stop. I'm not doing anything, Dante. She kept her voice even, conversational. I'm just showing everyone the photos. Turn it off. The attorneys already have everything. She watched him cross the distance between them with the measured approach of a man choosing between 3 bad options. Turning it off doesn't change what's already been delivered. He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough that the conversation was still private, or as private as anything could be in a room where 83 people had stopped breathing. His eyes moved over her face, She watched him do the calculation, what she had, what she'd done with it, whether there was any leverage point remaining, any thread he could pull. She watched him find nothing. "How long?" he said. "Since April." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. He was past guilt. Something raw and more fundamental. The particular expression of a man who has built his entire identity on never being outmaneuvered, encountering the fact of having been outmaneuvered completely. "The attorneys," he said. "How far?" "Further than you can reach tonight." His jaw worked. "Elena, don't." Her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "Don't say my name like that. You gave up the right to say my name like that a long time ago, and we are not going to stand here in front of your captains and your politicians and your business partners and pretend that you have something to explain. You don't have an explanation. You have a choice about how you behave in the next 5 minutes." The room was a painting. No one moved. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room, at Marco, who was sitting very still with Conchetta's hand clamped on his arm, at Sal, whose face was a careful blank, at the Ferreira men, who were watching with the attentive interest of people making a permanent assessment, at the politicians who were studying their dessert plates with the focused intensity of men who have already decided this evening never happened, at his own father, Enzo, seated at a table near the back in his wheelchair, his half-paralyzed face nonetheless completely legible. He looked at Enzo longest, and from the back of the room, in the voice of a man who had built an empire on the principle that personal weakness was the only truly unforgivable failure, Enzo Moretti said, loudly enough for the tables around him to hear, "Dante." Just the name. Nothing else. It was enough. Vivian Cross left before Dante reached her. She didn't run. Running would have been a kind of scene she was not able to produce at that moment, because she was not yet far enough from shock to access anything as immediate and physical as running. She walked, through the crowd that parted for her in the particular way crowds part for a person who is visibly disintegrating, out through the entrance hall with its photographs and its flowers, through the front door and into the night air, which hit her face with a coldness she was grateful for because cold meant sensation, and sensation meant she was still present in her own body. She made it to the bottom of the front steps before she stopped. She sat down on the step, in her blue dress, and put her face in her hands. The driver of her hired car was parked at the end of the circular driveway. He waited. He did not approach. He was, like Sullivan, like Patricia, like a certain category of people who work in proximity to private catastrophe, possessed of the instinct to simply hold the space without filling it. After 3 minutes, Vivienne took her hands away from her face. She looked at the night sky. She thought about 14 months of carefully assembled belief. The hotel rooms, the conversations, the words she'd been given, the way she'd built a future in her mind around a man who had been building a deception with the same hands he'd used to touch her face. She was not a stupid woman. She had a graduate degree, a successful career, and a demonstrated ability to read complex systems. The fact that she had not seen this was not a failure of intelligence. It was something else. The particular vulnerability of wanting something to be true so much that you stop asking whether it is. She had been weaponized by her own hope. Dante Moretti had handed her a narrative, and she had furnished it herself, decorated it, moved into it, and defended it against her own doubts, which had been regular and reasonable, and which she had ignored with the discipline of someone who has decided not to know something. She thought about the woman inside, the pregnant woman who had built this evening with the same patience and precision that Vivian applied to offshore compliance structures, who had stood in front of a room of 83 people and done what she'd done without raising her voice. Vivian thought about what kind of woman that required. Then she got up off the step, walked to the car, and told the driver to take her home. She did not look back at the house. Inside, the party was ending in the way parties end when the center has collapsed. Not all at once, but in a rapid, sequential exodus as each guest made the private calculation that the correct move was to be somewhere else. Politicians left first, their departures quick and frictionless. The practiced disappearance of people who have spent careers knowing when a room has become a liability. The business partners followed within minutes. The captains' wives gathered coats and bags with the controlled urgency of women who have learned through years of proximity to power that the moment a powerful man's authority cracks, the wise move is to not be standing next to the crack. Marco Vitelli was the last captain to leave. He stopped near the door and looked back at Dante, who was standing in the center of the emptying ballroom with the specific stillness of a man who has not yet fully processed the geometry of his situation. Marco opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing that fit, nothing that served, nothing in 30 years of working for this family that had equipped him with the right language for this specific moment. He left without speaking. Sal remained. He stood near the wall and waited, because that was what Sal did. He stayed when others left, and Dante had always known this and had always, privately, relied on it. Dante looked at him. "How long did you know?" Sal held his gaze. "I told her about Reese this evening. That was the first time I directly involved myself." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Long enough." Dante nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information he already understood. He looked around the room. The abandoned dessert plates, the candles still burning in their holders, the screen still displaying the last financial document Elena had programmed into the slideshow, Dante's own signature in the bottom right corner, legible and damning and permanent. He walked to the nearest table and sat down heavily in one of the white linen chairs. He put his elbows on the table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Sal watched him. "The documents," Dante said, his voice coming out rough at the edges in a way that Sal had genuinely never heard before. "She said they were beyond reach." "Do you believe her?" Dante took his hands away from his face. He looked at the empty ballroom. He looked at the screen. He looked at the chair where Elena had been sitting 30 minutes ago when the evening was still, technically, a celebration. "Yes," he said. "I believe her." "Then we need to talk about what comes next," Sal said, "because Reese left with the Ferreira men. They were talking on the front steps for 6 minutes before the cars came." Dante looked at him. "Reese is making a move," Sal said. "Whatever just happened in this room, he's going to use it. Tonight was a public demonstration that you can be caught off guard. That's information. The Ferreiras now have that information, and Reese just handed it to them personally." Dante stood up. Something in his posture had changed. The weight of the personal catastrophe was still there, but something else had surfaced through it, some older, harder instinct that had kept him alive since he was 31 years old. "Where's Reese now?" "Still on the property, last I saw. His car is still—" "Find him." Sal moved. Dante stood alone in the ballroom of his own estate, surrounded by the wreckage of an evening he had believed 4 hours ago was a demonstration of his dynasty's strength. The candles were still burning. The financial document was still on the screen. Somewhere upstairs, he knew, Elena was doing exactly what she'd told him she would do, moving through the next steps of a plan that was already executed and already beyond anything he could intercept. He had lost Elena. He had lost the room. He had lost the story he told about who Dante Moretti was. What he had not yet lost was the Empire. And if Reese was already in a car with the Ferreiras, the Empire was exactly what was currently at risk. Not from his wife, not from his own stupidity, but from the oldest threat in the playbook. A man inside the organization who had decided that a weakened king was easier to replace than Therese was in the garden. Sal found him near the stone wall at the east edge of the property, standing in the dark with his phone to his ear, his back to the house, his voice low enough that the words didn't carry but the cadence did. The particular rhythm of a man closing a deal, the measured give and take of negotiation rather than conversation. Sal didn't approach. He stood at the edge of the garden path and watched, and in 90 seconds he had enough to know that the call had been going on before he arrived, and that Reese was not calling his wife. He went back inside and found Dante in the hallway outside the ballroom, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearms, moving with the compressed energy of a man who has shunted grief into a compartment he'll deal with later, and is running entirely on instinct. "East Garden," Sal said. "He's on a call. Has been for a while." "Who?" "I don't know, but he's not upset about tonight. He's calm." Sal held Dante's eyes. The kind of calm you get when the thing you've been waiting for finally happens. Dante was quiet for 2 seconds. His jaw moved once. "Get Marco back here." "Marco's already gone." "Then call him." Dante's voice was flat and final in the way it got when the discussion portion of any situation was over. "Tell him I need him here in 20 minutes. Don't tell him why." Sal pulled out his phone and was already dialing as he moved back toward the kitchen. Dante went through the side door and into the garden. The night air was cold and damp. the kind of cold that comes after a warm day and settles in the low places first. The garden lights were on, low amber fixtures along the stone paths, and they threw more shadow than light, which suited the garden's general character of being a place designed to look peaceful while being full of things that didn't announce themselves. He heard Reese before he saw him. The call had ended. Reese was standing near the east wall with his phone in his hand, looking at it with the specific attention of a man reviewing what he'd just committed to. Dante came around the corner of the hedgerow and Reese looked up. Neither man spoke for a moment. Reese was 51 years old, with a face that showed most of those years and a body that moved like it had absorbed significant damage at various points and learned from all of it. He'd come up through the port operations 15 years ago, worked under 2 different captains before Dante elevated him, and had always had the quality of a man who understood power as a practical rather than personal matter. He didn't love Dante. He respected what Dante represented, and tonight, in the space of about 40 minutes, what Dante represented had shifted. "You called the Ferreras," Dante said. "Not a question." Reese looked at him steadily. "I had a conversation. On my property, during my event. You had a conversation. Your event." Reese's voice carried something measured in it, not quite contempt, not quite apology, something in the register of a man who has made a decision and is no longer pretending otherwise. "You want to talk about what happened tonight? What tonight was? Because from where I was sitting, that wasn't an event. That was a dissolution. Watch how you talk to me." "Dante," Reese said the name evenly. "I've been watching how I talked to you for 4 months, while you were distracted, while the dock situation went sideways, while Castellano started pushing on the northern contracts and you missed 2 meetings that mattered." He paused. "I've been watching how I talked to you while a man in your position made himself the most exposed he's ever been. And tonight that exposure became public in front of every person whose opinion matters to this organization's continued operation." The garden was very quiet around them. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, the last of the catering staff were loading equipment into vans. The sounds of it were distant and mundane in the way that ordinary sounds become surreal when the immediate foreground contains something else entirely. "You've been talking to Reese for months," Dante said. "Who else?" "I don't think that's the conversation we're having. I think it's exactly the conversation we're having." Dante took 1 step forward. "Give me a name." Reese looked at him for a long moment. The amber lights made the shadows on his face very deep. "Luca Ferreira wants a meeting, not a social call. A real meeting about the port contracts, the northern distribution, and the question of organizational leadership going forward." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "He's not asking you. He's telling me." The words hit the cold air and stayed there. Dante felt them land somewhere in his chest, not painfully, but precisely, the way a correctly placed blade lands, not hot, just accurate. Luca Ferreira, 44 years old. The younger of the 2 Ferreira brothers, the operational one, the one who handled the actual mechanics of the family's expansion while his older brother handled the politics. Luca had been watching the Moretti territory for 7 years, with the patience of a man who believed time was always on the side of the better prepared. Tonight, someone had handed him a reason to stop waiting. "You understand what you've done," Dante said. "I've positioned myself for what comes next." No heat in Reese's voice, no guilt, no bravado. Pure transaction. "That's what you taught me. You taught me that loyalty follows power, and that the man who reads the room first survives the room. I'm reading the room." "You're in my room," Dante said, "standing in my garden, on my property." His voice had dropped to something below conversational, something that required the listener to be very still to hear clearly. "Do you understand what that means for you right now, in this moment?" Reese understood exactly what it meant. He was a man who'd worked this world long enough to understand that the specific combination of elements currently present, isolated location, a powerful man with nothing left to perform for, and a betrayal that couldn't be walked back, created a particular kind of danger that no organizational calculation could fully account for. His hand moved slightly toward his jacket. "Don't." Dante said it without looking at the hand. He was looking at Reese's face. Reese stopped. "You're going to call Luca Ferreira," Dante said, "and you're going to tell him the meeting doesn't happen. You're going to tell him there was a misunderstanding about the nature of what tonight represented. And you're going to do it right now while I'm standing here. And if I don't, then whatever you are about to reach for in your jacket becomes the answer to its own question. The silence between them had a physical weight. Reese was calculating. Dante could see it behind his eyes, the rapid inventory of options, the assessment of what Dante was and wasn't willing to do here, tonight, in the garden of his own estate with catering staff 30 yards away and a pregnant wife somewhere in the house. The problem with the calculation was that tonight was not a normal night, and Dante's willingness to absorb consequences had been fundamentally altered by an evening in which he had already lost more than most men lost in a decade. Reese made the call. He held the phone to his ear and spoke in the flat, controlled voice of a man conveying information that contradicts what he said 10 minutes ago, and when it was over, he lowered the phone and looked at Dante with an expression that contained, for the first time, something that was not calculation. "That buys you time," Reese said. "It doesn't fix anything." "I know what it buys me." Dante held out his hand. "The phone." Reese handed it over. "Go home," Dante said. "Don't come to any Moretti property. Don't contact any Moretti associate. Don't make any calls tonight." He paused. "We'll discuss the rest tomorrow." Reese walked past him toward the garden gate. His footsteps were even, unhurried, the walk of a man who has not yet decided whether the stay of execution he's just received changes any of the underlying math. Dante stood in the garden alone for 60 seconds. He looked at the phone in his hand. Luca Ferreira's number was the last outgoing call. He memorized it, then snapped the phone in half against the edge of the stone wall. He went back inside. Marco arrived in 19 minutes. He came through the kitchen door in his overcoat, his face carrying the expression of a man who had been on the phone with Sal for 4 minutes and had been given just enough information to understand that the evening was not finished being dangerous. Dante was at the kitchen table. No jacket, no tie, a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked, Marco thought, like a man who had been hit by something structural rather than personal. Not grief, not anger, but the specific blankness of someone processing a reconfiguration of the fundamental load-bearing elements of their life. Marco sat across from him. He didn't say anything about the party. He didn't say anything about Elena. He was a man who understood that some things needed to be left alone long enough to become workable, and this was that kind of thing. "Reese," Dante said, "tell me." Dante told him. Marco listened without interrupting, which was a discipline Marco had spent years developing because his instinct was always to interrupt. When Dante finished, Marco was quiet for a moment. "Luca Ferreira." Marco said the name like he was identifying a weather system. "Luca's been ready for a move for 2 years. He's been waiting for the right read on the situation. Tonight gave him the read. Tonight gave everyone the read." Marco said it without flinching. "I'm telling you what it looked like, Dante. From the room. What that room saw tonight, it saw a man who didn't know what his own wife had been building for 3 months inside his own house. That's the read. That's what Luca Ferreira has, and Reese and whoever else Reese has been talking to." He leaned forward, his heavy forearms on the table. "You can be angry about it, or you can deal with it. What do you need from me?" Dante looked at him. 11 years he'd been looking at this face across tables. Enzo's face had looked like this once. Heavy, practical, undeceived about the nature of the world. "I need to know who Reese has been talking to inside the organization. Not Ferreira. Inside." "I can find that out." "I need it by morning." Marco nodded. He stood, buttoned his coat. At the kitchen door, he stopped and turned back, and for a moment his face did something it rarely did. It showed what was underneath the practical composure. "For what it's worth," he said, "she was always too good for this. Elena. From the beginning. I used to think you knew that." Dante said nothing. Marco left. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, upstairs, in the part of the house that was still, technically, shared, Dante could hear nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the particular quality of silence that means a person is being deliberately still. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He was not a man given to self-examination in the way that produces language. He had always operated more in the register of action than reflection, processing difficulty by moving through it rather than sitting with it. But sitting was all that was available to him at this moment, because every direction he could move in was currently blocked by the consequences of his own choices arranged like walls on all 4 sides. His phone buzzed, his own phone, not Reese's. He looked at the screen. Carol Voss's office number. at 11:47 at night. He picked up. "Mr. Moretti." Carol Voss's voice was the voice of someone who had been awake and prepared for this call. "I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that the filing has been submitted to the family court as of 11:30 tonight. Copies have been transmitted to 3 separate secure locations. Your legal team will receive formal notice in the morning." Dante was quiet. "The terms include a petition for primary custody, a claim on specific assets held under 3 LLC structures, and a request for emergency financial protection pending the dissolution proceedings." A brief pause. "I'd recommend speaking with your attorneys first thing tomorrow. There are some elements of the filing they'll need to respond to quickly." "Is she—" He stopped, started again. "Is she all right?" Carol Voss was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "My client is well." The call ended. Dante set the phone on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stood up and walked out of the kitchen, through the house, and up the stairs. The door to the master bedroom was closed. He stood in front of it. He raised his hand to knock, and then stopped with his knuckles an inch from the wood. He stood there for a long time with his hand raised. Then he lowered it and went to the guest room at the end of the hall and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Elena heard him in the hallway. She was sitting in the chair by the window in the bedroom. Not in bed. She hadn't been able to get to bed. Her body was too electric with the residual charge of the evening to permit anything as passive as lying down. She'd changed out of the pale dress and was in a robe, her feet bare on the floor, her hands in her lap. She heard his footsteps stop outside the door. She heard the small, compressed silence of a hand almost knocking. She watched the door and did not move and did not make a sound. She heard him walk to the guest room. She exhaled. She sat in the chair until she was sure he was not coming back to the door, and then she stood, moved to the small desk in the corner where her phone was charging, and sent a text to Carol Voss. "Filing received. Thank you." Carol's response came back in 40 seconds. "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow starts early." Elena looked at the screen. She looked at the closed door. She looked at the dark window with the city lights below it, the same view she'd looked at for 11 years from this room. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby was quiet. Had been quiet for the last few hours, which was either rest or the body's intuitive response to the seismic quality of the day. "It's done," Elena said, to the baby, to the room, to whatever remained of the version of her life that had existed before tonight. The hard part is done. She believed it when she said it. She did not yet know that at 11:58, while she was standing at the window, Reese was sitting in his car 3 blocks from the Moretti estate, making a second call to a number that was not Luca Ferreira's. A call to a man whose name had not yet appeared in any part of this story. A man whose relationship to the Moretti organization was not that of captain or rival or business partner, but something older and more dangerous than any of those categories. She did not yet know that Marco, driving across the city toward the first of the people he intended to speak to about Reese's internal network, had found his path blocked at the intersection of Hartwell and 6th by 2 cars parked perpendicular to traffic, and that the men who got out of those cars were not conducting a traffic stop. She did not yet know that Sal, who had stayed at the estate longer than anyone, had found something in the coat room that no guest should have left behind. Something small and black and deliberately placed. The kind of thing a man leaves in a location when he wants to know what happens in that location after he's gone. She stood at the window with her hand on her stomach, and she believed the hard part was done. It was 11:59. Marco's call came in at 12:14, and Dante picked up on the first ring, which told Marco that Dante had not been sleeping. "They stopped me on Hartwell," Marco said. His voice was compressed and tight. 3 men. I don't know them. Not Ferreira people. Wrong profile. Wrong approach. He paused, and in the pause, Dante heard something he'd never heard in Marco's voice in 11 years. The thin edge of something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "They took my phone, both phones. Let me keep this one." Another pause. "Dante, someone gave them very specific information about where I was going tonight and why." Dante was already on his feet. "Are you hurt?" "No, it was a message, not an action." Marco's breath was audible. "But the message is clear. Go home. Lock it down. Don't go anywhere until you hear from me." "Who are these people? Dante? Who is this?" Dante was already moving through the guest room, pulling on his jacket with the phone wedged between his ear and shoulder, his mind running at a speed that felt almost external to him, a machine operating independently of the man who was supposed to be running it. Someone who knew about tonight before tonight happened, Dante said. Someone who's been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. He ended the call. He stood in the guest room of his own house, and he thought about Reese, and about the second call Reese might have made after handing over his phone, and about the specific category of person who would respond to that call at midnight with 3 men in 2 cars positioned at an intersection with surgical precision. He thought about his father, Enzo, who had always said that the most dangerous enemy was not the one across the table, but the one who had been invited to the table years ago and had been patient enough to wait. He thought about the name he didn't yet have, the call Reese had made to the number that wasn't Ferreira's. He pulled on his jacket and went to the door of the guest room and stood in the hallway of his own house. The house he'd bought 12 years ago. The house Elena had made into something that resembled a home. The house where his daughter was currently growing toward the world inside his wife's body. And he felt the full specific weight of what it meant to have weakened himself at the precise moment when a predator had been watching for weakness. He had one move, possibly. He walked to the end of the hall and knocked on the door of the room where his father slept when he stayed at the estate. The voice that came from inside was immediate and alert, because Enzo Moretti had not slept deeply since the stroke, and because men who have spent their lives in danger develop a relationship with nighttime sounds that never fully relaxes. "It's me," Dante said, a pause. Then, "Come in." Enzo was sitting up in the hospital-style bed that had been installed in the room 3 years ago, his usable hand already on the edge of the mattress, his ruined face turned toward the door. The lamp beside him was on. He slept with it on, had since the stroke, another thing that was never discussed. Dante came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at his father. He had not, since the age of 31, come to this man for anything that resembled guidance. He had made a principle of not needing it, and the principle had served him until tonight. "Tell me about the man who came before Reese," Dante said. "The man Reese would go to if he needed backing that wasn't inside the organization. Before my time. Before yours, maybe." Enzo looked at him for a long moment. The working side of his face did the thing it did when he was thinking through something he hadn't thought about in years. A particular compression around the eye, a tension in the jaw. "Who told you there was such a man?" Enzo said. It wasn't quite a question. "Nobody told me. I'm looking at what happened tonight and I'm working backward." Dante leaned forward. His elbows were on his knees and his hands were clasped, and he was looking at his father with a directness that had not characterized their relationship in a long time. Someone coordinated this. Not Reese. Reese isn't capable of this kind of sequencing. Someone used Reese. Someone was watching this organization for a long time and saw tonight as the moment and had the infrastructure ready to move before I had time to respond. "Boss." He paused. "Who is it?" Enzo was quiet for long enough that Dante thought he wasn't going to answer. Then the old man said a name. It was a name Dante knew. Not well. A peripheral name. A name from the edges of conversations he'd half heard growing up. A name associated with the generation before his father's. A ghost category name that belonged to men who'd stepped back from direct involvement long before Dante took over. A name that should not have been active. "He's been out for 20 years, Dante said. "Men like that are never out," Enzo said. "They're just waiting to be useful again." His working eye was very steady. "If he's moving now, it's because someone made him an offer he valued, or because someone gave him information he'd been waiting for." The old man paused. "Tonight gave everyone information." Dante stood up. He stood at the foot of his father's bed and looked at the old man who had built the thing he'd inherited, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific terrifying clarity of having no room left to maneuver. "What do I do?" he said. Not asking for permission, asking for the knowledge of a man who had faced this category of problem before and survived it. Enzo looked at him for a moment. "You stop fighting the things you already lost," he said. "And you put everything that's left into the one thing that can still be won." He paused. "You know what that is." Dante looked at him. "The organization," Dante said. "The organization," Enzo confirmed. "Everything else tonight, the woman, the divorce, your pride, that's already decided. You can't unlose it. But the organization can still be held if you move in the next 6 hours before the man whose name I just gave you thinks you've identified him." The old man's voice was rough and slow, but each word landed with the precision of long practice. "You have one window. It closes at dawn." Dante stood at the foot of the bed. The lamp threw yellow light across his father's face and across his own hands, which were, he noted with some distant part of his attention, completely steady. He turned toward the door. "Dante." He stopped. "The girl," Enzo said. "Your daughter." His voice had changed, not softer exactly, but different, carrying something that the organizational conversation had not contained. "Whatever else you do tonight, whatever happens with the rest of it." He stopped, started again. "Make sure she has a father worth knowing, when the time comes." The room was very quiet. Dante walked out into the hallway and pulled the door softly closed behind him, and stood in the dark of his own house with his father's name still sounding in his head and the knowledge of what the next 6 hours required spreading through him like cold water, replacing every other thing, every grief and humiliation and personal devastation, with the single cold, clear imperative of a man who has been cornered and has chosen, in the last available moment, to... He moved before the house finished settling around him. Dante went to the study first, not for the scotch, not for the phone, but for the small fireproof cabinet behind the false panel in the bookshelf that Elena had known about for 6 years and had never mentioned knowing about, which was the kind of detail he understood now as a measurement of the distance between who he'd thought she was and who she actually was. Inside the cabinet were 2 passports, a significant amount of cash in 3 currencies, and a burner phone he rotated every 90 days out of habit, rather than any specific anticipation of need. He took the burner phone. The number he dialed had not been dialed in 4 years. It rang twice before a voice answered. Not groggy, not surprised, simply present. The way certain people are always present because they operate in the register of men who understand that the call, when it comes at inconvenient hours by design. "I need a name confirmed," Dante said, "and I need to know where he is." He said the name his father had given him. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds, which was itself information. 3 seconds from a man who did not pause for anything less than something real. "Where did you get that name?" the voice said. "Does it matter?" "It matters because if you got it wrong, you're about to make a very expensive mistake. And if you got it right, you're already in a situation I wouldn't want to be in." Another pause. "Who told you?" "My father." A longer pause. "Give me 40 minutes. Dante ended the call. He sat at the desk in the study, the same desk where 6 months ago he had stood at the window holding a glass of scotch and listening to Elena move quietly in the kitchen below. The same desk where he had texted Vivian 2 words and told himself it was controlled and temporary and would never touch anything that actually mattered. And he felt the full specific weight of the 40 minutes ahead of him with nowhere to put it except into stillness. He sat very still. He thought about Enzo's voice saying his daughter's name, the particular roughness of it, the way the old man, who had spent 50 years treating sentiment as a liability, had let something through in those 2 sentences that he had not let through in recent memory. He thought about Elena standing at the side of the ballroom with a remote control in her hand and her spine straight and her voice conversational while the entire architecture of his public life came down around both of them. He thought about what Marco had said in the kitchen. She was always too good for this. From the beginning. He had known that. He had known it at 22 and he had married her anyway, and he had spent 11 years understanding it as a kind of grace extended to him. That a woman of that particular quality had chosen to stand next to him, had built a life alongside his despite knowing the nature of that life, had loved him in the clear-eyed way of someone who is not pretending the person they love is something other than what they are. And he had taken that grace and used it as a surface to move across while he went elsewhere. He did not have language for what that made him. He sat in the study and did not look for language. He just let the understanding sit in him, undefended, in the dark. The call came back in 37 minutes. "The name is right," the voice said. "He's been running a parallel structure for 11 years, long-term positioning. He has 3 people inside your organization. Reese is one. The other 2 I don't have names for yet. He's been waiting for a destabilization event." A pause. Tonight was his destabilization event. "Where is he?" "He keeps a residence on the north end, Clement Tower, the penthouse. He doesn't move after midnight unless he's moving towards something, which means right now he's still there." Another pause. Dante, this man is not Reese. This is not a captain who got ambitious. He's been doing this for 40 years and he is very, very good at it. You go at him directly without preparation. Where on the north end? A silence in which the man on the other end made a calculation about the extent of his involvement in what came next. Then he gave the address. Dante memorized it, ended the call, and sat for 10 more seconds. Then he went to find Sal. Sal was in his car in the Moretti estate driveway, which told Dante everything about where Sal's head was. The man hadn't left, hadn't gone home, hadn't done anything except wait, because Sal Bracco had made a decision 11 years ago about which side of this particular man he was going to stand on, and he had not found cause to revise it in the intervening time. He looked at Dante through the windshield and rolled the window down. Dante leaned on the door. "How much do you know about a man named Gerard Lane?" Sal's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A tightening, a recognition. "Enough," he said carefully. "What's enough?" "Enough to know that Enzo spent 3 years in the late 90s trying to build a case against him and eventually decided the better play was to reach an understanding. The understanding held." Sal looked at him steadily. "Until tonight, apparently. He has people inside. Reese is confirmed. 2 others I don't have yet." "The 2 others." Sal was quiet for a moment. "Reese had dinners with Paulie Vec twice in the last month. Paulie attributed it to port business. I didn't push it." He paused. "Vec and a man named Driscoll from the Northern Contracts. 3 names. Dante had the shape of it now. The internal scaffolding that Lane had assembled inside the organization over years, patient and invisible, waiting for the moment when the load-bearing wall weakened enough that the scaffolding could become the structure. "I need 2 hours," Dante said, "and I need you to make sure nothing moves inside the organization while I'm dealing with this. If Vec or Driscoll try to contact anyone, I want to know before the contact completes." "Where are you going?" "To have a conversation." Sal looked at him. "Alone?" "Yes." "Dante, if I bring people, it announces itself. If it announces itself, he moves and I lose the window." Dante straightened up from the car door. "I'm going to talk to the man. That's all." Sal looked at him with the expression of a man who understands that what he's being told is technically true and practically incomplete. "What do you want me to do if you don't come back?" "Make sure the organization holds, and make sure Elena gets everything the divorce settlement says she's entitled to. Don't let anyone complicate that process." The instruction landed between them with the specific weight of a man settling an account he acknowledges is legitimate. Sal nodded once. "Come back," he said. Not a plea. A directive. Dante walked to his car. Clement Tower was a 40-story residential building on the north end of the city that had been built in the mid-90s with the kind of money that didn't ask where it came from and didn't advertise where it was going. The penthouse had been held under a property management company for 11 years. The lobby concierge, when Dante presented himself at 12:58 in the morning, received the name Dante gave, not his own name, a name that meant something specific to the building's permanent residents, and made a brief call, and then directed him to the private elevator without further comment. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse entrance hall. Gerard Lane was waiting. He was 73 years old, and he looked like a man who had decided, sometime in his 60s, to simply stop performing anything. No pretense of youth, no effort at impression. He was lean and white-haired and dressed in a dark robe over slacks, and he was standing in the entrance hall of his penthouse at 1 in the morning as though he had been expecting this visit since approximately 8 o'clock that evening. "Dante Moretti," he said, "your father's son." "You know why I'm here." "I know why you think you're here." Lane turned and walked into the main room of the penthouse, which was large and sparsely furnished in the way of rooms belonging to people who have stopped needing to impress anyone. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave out over the city's north end, a wide, dark field of lights, the city in its nighttime operation, indifferent and constant. "Come in." Dante followed him. He stayed on his feet. Lane sat in a chair near the windows and looked at him with the patient assessment of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough dangerous people to have lost the physiological response to danger that most people retain. "You put 3 people inside my organization," Dante said. "I made 3 investments over a period of years," Lane said. "The distinction matters. It doesn't matter to me. It might, when you think about it more carefully." Lane crossed one leg over the other. His hands were on the arms of the chair, relaxed. I don't want your organization, Dante. I want access to specific operations your organization controls. The port contracts, the northern distribution infrastructure. I've wanted them for a long time. Your father and I reached an arrangement that gave me a degree of that access in exchange for certain protections he valued. When your father retired, the arrangement became, he paused, choosing the word, informal, meaning you've been running your people inside my operation without a corresponding benefit flowing the other direction. Meaning the arrangement lapsed and I chose not to renegotiate from a position of equality when I might eventually be able to negotiate from a position of advantage. Lane said it without apology, stating mechanics. Tonight appeared to be that moment. Dante looked at him for a long time. The city lights spread behind Lane's head in a wide, dark panorama, and the room smelled like old paper and something that might have been tea. Call it off, Dante said. Lane looked at him. What are you offering? The original arrangement, whatever my father gave you, access, protection, operational latitude in the defined areas, restored, documented, held by a third party of your choosing. Lane was quiet. He was not, Dante could see, a man who deliberated theatrically. The quiet was real, actual consideration, running the calculation. Reese, Lane said. Reese is finished. Vec and Driscoll will be managed. Dante paused. Your access to the organization through those channels is over, but the access through the formal arrangement would be restored, with Sal Bracco as the operational point of contact going forward. Bracco. Lane considered the name. Your father trusted Bracco. So do I. Another silence. The city lights didn't move. Your father would not have come here alone, Lane said. Not a criticism, an observation. My father had more resources available at 1 in the morning than I currently do, Dante said. I came with what I had. Something shifted in Lane's face. Not warmth, nothing so available as warmth, but a kind of recognition that passed between men who understand that the willingness to walk into a room without backup is itself a form of language. The Ferreira conversation, Lane said. Reese initiated that. I didn't authorize it. I want that understood. Understood. I was positioning, not moving. There's a difference. I understand the difference. Lane looked at him for one long final moment. Then he uncrossed his legs and stood and extended his hand. Dante shook it. It was the kind of handshake that, in the world both men operated in, meant more than most written documents and less than complete trust, which was the precise register in which both men were willing to operate. Tell Bracco to call me Monday, Lane said. We'll formalize the terms. Dante nodded. He walked back to the elevator. Behind him, he heard Lane move to the windows, resuming whatever private assessment of the city he'd been conducting before the evening's interruption. The elevator descended in silence. The lobby concierge did not look up when Dante crossed to the door. He stepped out into the pre-dawn air. It was cold and very still, the city in its quietest hour, the interval between the night people going home and the morning people arriving. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in. Cold, exhaust, the distant smell of the river 2 miles east. He sat in his car without starting it for a long time. He drove home as the first gray light was beginning at the edges of the sky. The house was quiet. He came in through the kitchen, moved through the downstairs without turning on lights, and went upstairs. He stopped at the door of the master bedroom. He did not raise his hand to knock this time. He went to the nursery. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room in the gray pre-dawn light. The crib, the solid wood dresser Elena had refinished from the estate sale. The small lamp in the corner that threw a warm circle on the ceiling when it was on. He came into the room and sat in the low rocking chair in the corner that he had not been the one to choose or place or suggest, and he sat in it and looked at the room. He sat there until he heard Elena's door open, soft footsteps in the hall, and then her shape in the doorway. She was in a robe. Her hair was loose. She looked at him across the dim room, and her expression was not surprised, not afraid, not angry. It was something much more tired than any of those things. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been braced for a long time and is still braced because the situation has not yet clarified enough to allow anything else. What happened? She said. Not alarmed, just asking. I handled something. He paused. The organization is stable. The situation with Reese and the external threat, it's been resolved. She looked at him. Are you hurt? No. She was quiet for a moment, reading him the way she always read him, and he understood with a clarity that had not been available to him before tonight that this capacity she had to look at him and see accurately was not something that had been replaced or made obsolete by anything he'd done. It was simply something he had not deserved. You should sleep, she said. Elena. He said her name and stopped. There was too much to say and none of the available language was adequate. He had always known this, on some level, that the things that mattered most were the things that language consistently failed. He had spent his life in a world that understood that, where agreements were sealed with handshakes and silences and the specific calibration of a look across a room because words were the least reliable currency available. Don't, she said, gently. Not tonight. I'm not going to ask you to... He stopped, started again. I know what I did. I know there's no version of this where I explain it in a way that makes it a different thing than what it was. He was looking at the crib. I just need you to know that I know that. I'm not going to show up at the lawyers and try to complicate it. I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be. She was very still in the doorway. I want her to have... He stopped. His voice had done something unexpected, a roughness at the edge of it that he did not try to clear. I want her to have a father worth knowing, when the time comes. The words were his father's. He didn't feel the need to say that. Elena looked at him for a long time from the doorway of the room she had assembled piece by piece for the child they had made together. Her face in the gray light was very clear. Clear of performance, clear of strategy, just her actual face, which was the face of a woman who had loved a specific man for 11 years and had been failed by him, and had survived the failing and was now standing in the wreckage of the life they'd built together, assessing what could be carried forward and what had to be left. Then be that, she said. Don't tell me. Be it. She went back to her room. Dante sat in the rocking chair in the nursery until the light outside had shifted from gray to pale gold, and the city began to reconstitute itself into its daytime version. And somewhere a block away someone started a car, and somewhere in the house the heating system clicked on, and the ordinary world reasserted itself over the night's events with the indifferent efficiency it always brought to the task. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the family court building on Municipal Drive. Elena was there with Carol Voss. Dante was there with his attorneys. They sat on opposite sides of an aisle that was not very wide, and the proceeding lasted 40 minutes, and when it was done the judge signed the order and the clerk stamped it. And the thing that had been true in every meaningful sense for months became true on paper as well. Elena received primary custody of their daughter, whose name they had agreed on in a single phone call 6 weeks earlier, a call that lasted 4 minutes and was almost entirely practical, and ended with Dante saying the name quietly, just the name, and then not saying anything else, and Elena saying she'd see him at the custody schedule's first exchange point and the call into ending. The name was Clara. She received the specific assets that Carol Voss had identified and structured into the settlement in a way that Dante's attorneys had challenged on 3 points and been unable to move. She received the family residence, which she had already decided to sell, not out of spite, but because the house was not the thing she wanted to carry forward, and Clara did not need to grow up in a monument to a version of her parents' relationship that had not, in the end, been the whole truth. She received child support structured on a schedule that Dante had not contested. He had not contested anything in the settlement after that first week. Carol Voss had noted this to Elena with a professional neutrality that almost concealed her surprise, and Elena had said she knew, and left it at that. Dante received what remained of his empire, which was diminished but not destroyed. Reese had been removed. The specific mechanics of that removal were never discussed in any legal proceeding, and were not part of any documented record. Vec and Driscoll had resigned from their positions within the organization in the same week, within 2 days of each other, citing personal reasons. Marco Vitelli resumed his role as senior captain with a solidity that suggested the near miss of the Lane situation had clarified certain things for him about the value of what he was actually protecting. Sal Bracco called Gerard Lane the following Monday, as instructed, and the two men spent 90 minutes on the phone establishing the terms of an arrangement that was less a peace treaty than a formalized acknowledgement of the landscape as it actually existed. The arrangement held. It was not warm, and it was not simple, and it required ongoing maintenance, but it held, which in the world both men operated in was the standard by which most things were judged. Dante remained feared. He remained wealthy. He remained, by most available measurements, powerful. He also remained alone in a house that was not the Moretti estate. He'd bought a smaller place on the west side, a modern construction without the weight of his family's history in every room. And he sat most evenings in a study that did not yet smell like anything in particular because he had not lived in it long enough to leave an impression. And he kept a photograph on the desk that Sullivan had taken without being asked to, a photograph of an ultrasound image that he had not known was being documented and that had appeared in his attorney's office inside a plain envelope one morning with no note. Clara Moretti was born on a Wednesday in late autumn, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, at a hospital on the east side of the city. Elena's cousin, Adriana, was in the waiting room. Carol Voss had sent flowers. Sullivan had sent nothing because that was not the kind of relationship they had, but he called 2 days later and said he was glad to hear it went well, and Elena had said thank you and meant it. Dante was notified by a text from Elena's number at 4:47 in the morning. She's here. She's healthy. And then, after a pause of several minutes, she has your eyes. He sat with that for a long time. He met Clara for the first time at the custody exchange 3 weeks later, in the parking lot of a community center on the east side that was neutral ground. Elena's attorney's suggestion, accepted without negotiation. Elena carried Clara out in a car seat and set the car seat down and stepped back, and Dante crouched in front of it and looked at his daughter for the first time. Clara looked back at him with the unfocused, serious attention of a 3-week-old who is still assembling the world from its component parts. She had Elena's mouth. She had, as reported, his eyes. He put one finger against her hand and she gripped it. The involuntary, total grip of a newborn. No preference, no judgment, just the fundamental animal certainty that what you can hold, you hold. And Dante Moretti, who had not cried since he was 9 years old, felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for and did not try to name. He looked up at Elena, who was standing 5 feet away with her arms crossed against the cold, watching him. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, just watching, the way she had always watched him. With her full attention, reading the truth of the thing rather than the performance of it. "Thank you," he said. He meant everything. He knew she knew he meant everything. She nodded. She picked up the car seat and Clara released his finger and Elena walked back to her car. He stood in the parking lot and watched them go. There is a particular kind of loss that doesn't announce itself all at once. It settles in over time in the specific texture of empty rooms and routines that have been modified to account for an absence, in the way a man learns to make coffee for one and stops after a while, making it for two by accident. Dante learned this slowly in the year that followed. He ran his empire. He held his territory. He managed the lane arrangement and the Ferreira detente and the ongoing ordinary brutality of operating in a world where everything was always contingent and trust was always provisional, and the best you could achieve on any given day was a workable stability that might or might not survive the week. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The goodness had not diminished. What had changed was the silence of the rooms he moved through, and the particular weight of understanding that the silence was not an accident or a circumstance. It was a consequence, his consequence, shaped by his own hands out of choices he had made when other choices were available. He saw Clara every week. He drove to the east side on Saturdays and sat on Elena's new front porch, a small house in a residential neighborhood, a house with a garden that was beginning to show what it would eventually become, a house that smelled like the things Elena cooked, and the particular warmth of a woman making a home without the weight of an empire pressing down on every room. And Elena brought Clara out and sat in the chair across from him, and they talked, carefully and sometimes almost easily, about Clara's development, about her eating and sleeping and the way she had begun, at 4 months, to laugh at things nobody in the room had said. They did not talk about the past. They had, without discussion, agreed that the past was not a room either of them needed to revisit. They talked about Clara. It was not warmth, what existed between them. It was not friendship. It was something more specific and harder won. The functional respect of two people who have been through something that revealed them both completely and have chosen, out of something that is not forgiveness but is adjacent to it, to be decent to each other in the specific way that the child between them requires. Elena went back to the museum. She curated an exhibition in the spring that was reviewed in 2 city publications. She had dinner with Adriana twice a month. She had, as far as Dante could observe from the modest distance their arrangement permitted, built something that was not a performance of a life but an actual one, assembled from the things she had chosen rather than the things she'd inherited by marrying into an empire. She did not appear to be waiting for anything. That, more than any of it, was what he understood last. That the thing he had most failed to see, for 11 years, was that Elena Moretti had never needed the empire. She had needed him, the specific man she had believed he was, the man he was partially capable of being, the man he had been in fragments and glimpses across the length of their marriage. And when that man had made himself unavailable, she had not waited for his return. She had built something that did not require him. He sat on her porch on a Saturday in late spring and held Clara, who was 7 months old and had begun to demonstrate a distinct personality that involved strong opinions about which direction she faced. And he watched Elena move around the garden with the ease of a woman on good terms with her own life. And he thought about a hotel restaurant called Arlene's on the corner of 5th and Whitmore with candles on every table, and a rainy evening, and a woman in a blue dress being greeted with a smile that had once belonged to someone else. He thought about everything that had been set in motion by that moment. The long, patient construction Elena had built in response. The evening in the ballroom, the night that followed, the name his father had given him in the lamplight. He thought about how much of it had been survivable, and at what cost. Clara grabbed a fistful of his collar and pulled with the cheerful determination of someone who has not yet developed any concept of the weight of things, and he caught her hand and she laughed, and the sound of it was the only sound in the garden for a moment. Elena looked over from the garden bed where she was working. She looked at her daughter, laughing, and then at the man holding her, and her expression did what it sometimes did in these moments. Something passed through it that was not reconstructed love and not hatred and not the performance of either, just the honest, complicated recognition of a person who is looking at a true thing and choosing to hold it clearly rather than make it simpler than it is. She held it for a moment, then she went back to the garden. Dante held his daughter in the late spring light and listened to the neighborhood around him. Dogs, a distant lawnmower, the sound of children somewhere on the next block. And understood, in the slow and irreversible way that real understanding arrives, that the kingdom he had lost was the only one that had ever given the other kingdom its meaning, and that the loss was his to carry, and that carrying it well, in the specific form of the small person currently destroying his collar, was the only remaining way to make any of it count for something. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. It was what he had. He held it, and the morning continued, and Clara laughed again at something only she could see, and Elena's hands moved in the good dark earth of her garden, and the city went on being the city, indifferent and constant and full of people making choices they would spend years living inside. The story did not end cleanly. Stories of this kind never do. But it ended honestly, which is rarer and harder, and in the long accounting of things, worth considerably more.